So I've had the Boss Waza tube amp expander unit for approximately 2 weeks now, and the honeymoon phase does seem to be over for the most part. Still undecided as to whether or not I am going to keep it, and we'll get into the reasons why in this video, hopefully. I've had the Torpedo Captor for maybe a year or so now, and prior to that I did have the Sur reactive load non-IR version of that. Overall, I would say they all tend to sound pretty similar if you're recording into impulse responses, but the TAE probably has the edge for the reamping feature. We will try and also compare using this to reamp versus using the Captor and then just using another valve amp to reamp the signal, which is another way that I tend to do it, and it's a much cheaper option or more cost-effective option because you can buy a pretty good amp and the Captor for the cost of the Boss TAE. So trying to figure out, is it really worth having when you can basically have your first amp, some sort of non-master volume Marshall vintage style circuit where you want to use a load box, and then a second amp for another sound. In my case, it's often a Fender blackface style amp, for cleans and stuff, and I can reamp with that. So we're probably just going to test. What we're going to do is I'm going to use my Marshall SV20 and into both loads, and we're going to reamp first using the TAE into the cab, and then also reamp using a deluxe reverb but into this cab as well to keep everything constant. So the only difference there is going to be the method to reamp, and I imagine it will sound a little bit more natural probably with the TAE doing the reamping, because it's just a sort of plain solid state power amp with built-in effects, of course, and the EQ. So it comes down to whether you really are going to make use of all the extra features that this provides. The delays and the built-in EQ, it's all very good, and we'll do some screen recording of the editor software, which is decent, it's usable, but it does mean you're going to have a USB cable running around your sort of studio setup while you're using it, which can be a pain for some people. Before that, I just wanted to touch on some of the comments I've seen online on the gear page and places like that around the impedance load that these sorts of units present to an amp, because there are some worries with the measurements taken that they're putting your expensive valve amp or tube amp in danger of damaging the output transformer or the tubes. So, got a multimeter here, and this speaker cable is connected to the 2x12 cab that the boxes are sitting on here. This is just a Zilla vertical 212 with greenbacks in it. So right now the speaker cable is just plugged into the cab, and we're going to take a reading. And the thing to note is that we're measuring DC resistance, we're not measuring impedance, which applies to, as far as I know, alternating current circuits. So it's an 8 ohm cab with two 16 ohm greenbacks wired in parallel. It will dance around a little bit until it sort of settles. So we're getting about 9 ohms there or thereabouts. This is a pretty cheap multimeter, so at lower resistance values, closer as you approach 0 ohms, I think the accuracy does get pretty poor, but close enough for rock and roll, as they say. Now we're going to connect that to the Waza TAE. It's off, which there is a difference to the load it presents when it's on and off, but the good news is at least it does present a load when it's off. So we've just hooked that up, and we're getting about 35 ohms. So it's not ideal, but you have to keep in mind that's not what the amp is seeing across the entire frequency range. Impedance is measured, is frequency dependent, whereas we're just measuring the DC resistance. If I switch the rear selector to 8 ohms, let's see if it changes at all. No change while it's off. So you will notice, if we switch it on, what does change it, and what people were worried about is that when you bring the actual resonance and presence load switches up to the higher levels, you do see some really high readings here. Sorry, you do see some really high readings here as you bring these up. So for example, the resonance set to low mid and the presence set high, we're already in the hundreds there, and it'll get it up to about 230, 250, 248 there, with both of those on high, which I believe is it's the Brit Stack 4x12 closed setting on the top panel here. That doesn't mean that the amp is seeing a set. It doesn't make the amp think that it's trying to push a 248 ohm speaker though. What that does mean is that, well, what I think it means is that you've got a resonant peak with a very high impedance at a certain frequency that approximates what this is measuring for DC resistance right now. If you were worried about it, you could keep the mainly the resonance switch down. See, it already halves there, and we're back down at the normal range when it's on the low setting there. Let's just compare that to the Captor now. So quite similar. The 16 ohm Captor measures 46.8 ohms DC resistance. I don't think it changes if you have it powered by 9 volts or the phantom power, and that's for a 16 ohm torpedo Captor. So my main point from that demonstration is just that I do think a lot of people maybe misunderstand, including myself, misunderstand the difference between impedance and DC resistance. But it is important to note that you can't just measure DC resistance and presume that the amp is going to see that impedance amount across the entire frequency range. You do see there's a lot of posts about people burning out certain parts of their amps, but you also see the load box manufacturers all say this a lot, is that you don't run your amp on 10 all the time unless maybe you're Eddie Van Halen. I do think it's largely overblown. Things like, Hendrix having had all his amps on 10 all the time, or any of the classic rock guys. If you listen to the recordings, it doesn't sound like that. If you know how a vintage style Marshall sounds at the different volume levels, I think it's a common misconception that Marshalls sound best on 10. That is a sound that they do, but they have other tones when they're not on 10, and it doesn't always need to be there to get the best sound from it. So I would encourage people to read through some of the posts from Husky on the gear page. That is John Sear. Obviously he makes his own load box, and he hasn't trashed the Waza TAE at all. And in a lot of cases, he seems to be putting people's minds at ease by trying to explain what I have attempted to explain here about the measured loads that people are getting, and assuming that's the reason for their amps having issues. It even says it in the Waza manual regarding cranking your amp, tube amp's volume setting. Because this unit allows you to reduce the volume while preserving the character and feeling of the tube amp sound, it is possible that you might raise the volume of the tube amp too high, placing an excessive load on the tube amp in use. Set the volume appropriately. Raising the volume excessively so that oscillation occurs might cause the amp to malfunction. That's the other thing. The sewer reactive load and the Captor and the TAE, you will get oscillation if you have your amp cranked and you put the guitar too close to the load box, almost no matter what, or the load box too close to the amp itself. I think there's some sort of induction going on from the transformers from the amp itself to the load of the load box. If you have the volume and gain right up, you're going to get oscillation. It's not a fault of any of those units. It's just a natural, unavoidable thing. So yeah, I will post the gear page thread links in the video description if anyone wants to do any further reading. It's kind of interesting. It's not that interesting though. It's just sort of nerding out on what impedance is. It's quite an interesting topic really, because it gets pretty complex when you're talking about a load that the amp is seeing and how the speaker moving in the air interacts with the resonances of the cabinet based on the dimensions of the cabinet and the materials, as well as how the actual inertia of the speaker interacts with the air in the cabinet compared to being in free air. Anyway, we're going to record some clips of both load boxes that I've currently got running into impulse responses, as well as reamping, and mainly just to find out if there's a difference worth paying for with the TAE over the Captor in terms of how it preserves the high end, especially when we're cranking like a bright non-master volume Marshall into both, because that's important to a lot of people. At this stage, I am looking for reasons to get rid of the TAE, to be honest, because I would rather put that extra, I don't know, $600 US or so price difference towards a guitar or an amp or other kind of more fun equipment than a load box, as nice as the TAE is.